So, Conrad,
Hey, Melinda, how are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm excited about today's topic.
I am too, very, very much so. So I think that today we're going to have a first, and I can't wait to get into that. But you know, we're talking about one of my absolute favorite topics of all time, which is anything to do with the Satanic Panic. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with it. It is like maybe it's because I felt so, targeted by it as a teenager. I don't really know. But uh, we've talked about a bunch of things sort of related to this over the years, but I think that today is sort of something that I didn't even realize was as big of a rabbit hole, no pun intended, as it actually turns out to be. And I'm sure our guest has heard that joke way too many times, and so I apologize. But um, without wasting too much time, I want to go ahead and jump right into it because we have a lot to talk about. So, our topic this month, welcome to Dreamland, everyone, by the way. Our topic this month is drugs, devils, and diaries, the Go Ask Alice Unmasked topic. So, really quick, I want to give a content warning because some of the subject matter we will be talking about pertains to suicide. So, if that's a sensitive topic for you, just be aware that we will be touching on that, not at length, but just it's a huge part of the story, so we can't avoid talking about it a little. So I do want to say that how we picked this topic, Conrad, have you ever heard of the book Go Ask Alice before we started doing this research?
No, I hadn't. I don't think it made much of a splash in the UK, or if it did, I completely missed it. So
Ah,
this was one of those ones where you brought something to me that was completely new, and I really enjoyed delving into it.
yeah. Well, that's awesome. I know as a kid in the early 80s, my school must have been one of the early adopters for the Scholastic book fairs. I don't know if you have ever seen these wonderful little
Yes. Yeah.
newsprint things. And I think I got the book Go Ask Alice when I was maybe in the fourth grade, which is super inappropriate. But
Wow.
that's just how I was. So anyway, I really believed it. Like I really, if anyone who's heard of this, the original Go Ask Alice book, if you were in the 80s and growing up in the 80s, you probably believed it too, because that's what we were all sort of told, right? Um,
Mm.
but that's not really true. And Conrad, I want you to maybe introduce our guest, and he can tell us a lot more about that.
Yes, well, we're very excited to be joined by a special guest who can guide us down this rabbit hole into a world of LSD, satanic panic, and the Mormon housewife who terrified an entire generation. He's the former host of a nationally syndicated talk radio show, the co author with Lisa Desjardins of Zombie Economics, and apparently the star of a commercial for tyres. He's also the author of Unmask Alice, a fascinating exploration of today's topic. So, very warm welcome to Rick Emerson. Hello, sir.
Howdy and hello. Thank you for the invitation. Also, it seems like both of you are broadcasting from a really great EDM club somewhere, and I'm at like a Tupperware party somewhere in the suburbs. My lighting game is not on point here. That's okay. Glad to be here.
We're happy to have you. And I think that to get us into the whole topic that we're going to be talking about today, just briefly for the few people who may or may not know about the books, I wanted to just give a really sort of abbreviated overview of what they are. So there are really two books, not just Go Ask Alice, but two books we'll be talking about. The first one is of course, Go Ask Alice, which was published in 1971 by Prentice Hall. And that's the first edition on the left there. It was sold to the public as an actual diary of a 15-year-old drug user in the early 70s. The unnamed subject gets dosed with LSD at a party, then she descends into harder drugs, ends up selling them to kids, she runs away, and much, much more before coming home and reforming herself. But then sometime after that, she ends her diary, she stops writing in it, and then she is found overdosed by her parents, according to a little note at the end of the book. So, Rick, am I covering that accurately? Am I leaving out any salient points?
No, that is absolutely correct. Yeah, it was the supposed posthumous diary of a teenage drug user who, yeah, overdoses and leaves the diary behind. Absolutely.
Right. So by 1975, more than 3 million copies of the book had reportedly been sold. And by 1979, the paperback edition had been reprinted 43 times. The book remained continuously in print over the ensuing decades, with reported sales of over 4 million copies by 1998. So this thing sold for decades. It's not like it was just a flash in the pan in 70s and then gone. Like, so there were 5 million copies sold by 2009. And then even in, they even had a TV movie. So 1970, of course you have to, right?
Yeah.
So 1973, we've got the wonderful made-for-TV movie starring Jamie Smith Jackson, which, you know, this is her. She's super wholesome looking, isn't she? I mean, she's just American as apple pie. We also have William Shatner and Andy Griffith, which is a weird choice, I think. But I'd like to just show William Shatner here. I didn't recognize him. Like I kept thinking, I keep hearing that he's in this movie, but I don't see him. And finally, I realized that that's him, and I'm like, it's partially. It feels like he's wearing a disguise in a Scooby-Doo episode.
And he also doesn't. There's no other way to put this. He also doesn't act like William Shatner in this movie. I mean, you expect him to just sort of be doing his. I think I call it his hard angular, cadence, his sort of Star Trek cadence. And he actually. I mean, this sounds like a backhanded compliment or a passive insult. But I mean, he sort of is actually acting in a way that I think some of his other material didn't require him to do, and he was surprisingly good in this film.
It's true. Yeah. I always remember that my husband tells the story about Nicholas Meyer when in the Wrath of Khan behind the scenes talks about having to get Shatner to say the line like 50, 60 times to tire him out so that he would just say it flat and then it was perfect.
I think we call that the Fincher approach to acting.
Right. So yeah, I think that, you can't take away how amazing that looks. But I will say the TV movie, when I watched it, I'd never seen it before. It was kind of boring. Like all of the really meaty stuff that's in the book is cut out, obviously. Kind of had to be, right, to be on ABC.
Yeah, I mean, there's whole sections of the book that are just, I mean, that even today today they would raise a lot of eyebrows for, I think, similar but different reasons, but also just they would be almost impossible. They would have been almost impossible to show on television, not just because of the kind of content codes of the time, but also just in terms of their depiction, because so much of it is so surreal and it takes place in this kind of drug-induced sort of mental hellscape that would have been really difficult to convey in a way that did not come off as corny in the 70s. And also they're dealing with a TV movie, so I think the runtime is like 72 minutes, and so it's like done as fast as possible, and they just cut out anything that got in the way. Right.
So basically it seems like Alice seemed to really resonate with people, the book and the movie, but mostly the book. What do you think made it so appealing to a 70s audience? Do you have any thoughts on why people in the 70s were just really taken with this book?
I think for one thing, I think then as now, there was this sort of disconnect between parents and especially teenagers, and it was, and teenagers are not always very forthcoming about their inner thoughts or what's going on in their life, especially if it's something that is sort of inappropriate, or if it's dealing with things that they are embarrassed or mortified to talk to their parents about. And so for parents, Go Ask Alice was almost like receiving this communique from the other side. It was sort of like this, it was like a message smuggled out from the land of teenagedom. And it was in case you wonder what your sullen, moody teenager who won't talk to you is actually doing and thinking, here's this book. And not only is it a book that tells you this, it's a book that comes from ostensibly an unimpeachable source. It is from a 16, 17-year-old girl. And so therefore, this, you can trust that this is the reality. And also, even now, you see something that is labeled by anonymous, that's immediately, that is a publishing trick we see again and again and again, even now. Any book that comes out or any news report, anything that is attributed to not just an unnamed source, but to capital A anonymous. That is immediately fascinating. And when you link that with the idea of reading someone's diary, because that is, reading someone else's diary is beyond, it's beyond socially unacceptable. It's beyond, it's it really is considered just a grave offense. That's a mortal sin to read someone else's diary. But here, A, she's dead, and B, not only are you, reading her diary, but you're actually being told you should. It's
That's
good for
right.
you. It's educational.
It's
And so
good.
yeah, permission to read this thing that, that you would normally never be allowed to read. And, and also, it must be said, the coming into it with the idea that this is the diary of not just a teenage drug user, but a dead teenage drug user, a posthumous diary.
Hmm.
The sad reality is that adds a sort of layer of mystique to it. It wraps it in intrigue that it would not otherwise probably have. And I think all those things coalesced, and it really, and so I think adults, read it thinking, this is what my teenager is up to, and I think a lot of teenagers read it thinking, here is someone who understands what it's like to be, to be a teenager. Here's someone who kind of knows what I'm going through.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Yeah.
so. So, but when the 80s came around, that was definitely the 70s with the psychedelics that had started in the 60s, and there's acid is sort of her gateway drug, which is weird, but there it is. There were a lot of new fears in the zeitgeist when the 80s started, and so I feel like we needed a new kind of cautionary tale. So that leads us to our second book, which, Conrad, you read this book.
Yes, I did. Yes. But before that, the lady behind these books, her name's Beatrice Sparks. We will talk about her a little bit more later on, but she was faced with that immortal struggle, how to follow up a hit first album and a phenomenal one. As we've talked about, this Alice was a colossal hit. It wasn't just a bestseller, it was a cultural phenomenon. So Sparks pitched various ideas to her publisher. She settled on one she could take public credit for, rather than it being anonymous. So it was a compendium of tales of troubled teens, supposedly based on her interviews of more than 1,000 runaways in 37 cities. So talk about exhaustive research, even puts us to shame, Melinda.
I
This
think that
one,
might even put Rick to shame. That's a lot of research back in the 80s and 70s.
it's phenomenal, yeah, without the internet. It was called Voices, and there it is, Beatrice Sparks, author of the multi-million copy international bestseller Go Ask Alice. But I understand it isn't very good, Rick. Is that right?
It is quite a slog to get through. I'll put it that way. So it is, as you say, it's the original title for Voices. The title she pitched it as was, I believe, Go Ask Henry, Mark, and Millie. There are four teenagers profile, but she wanted to call it Go Ask Henry, Mark, and Millie. So clearly trying to leverage the success of Go Ask Alice while also kind of getting away from just having it be a single. It's because it also, following up Go Ask Alice, presents this other problem, especially if she is presented as the quote editor of a real diary. It's like, well, how many diaries can one person find? And so the solution seems to be the much more plausible, I'll interview 1,000 teenagers in 37 cities, all of whom end up speaking exactly the same way. And that way is the exact same way that Beatrice Sparks wrote and spoke. But yeah, it ends up being four extremely long monologues by four extremely similar sounding teenagers. And it just becomes this blur of white noise. And it's a book that tries really hard to shock and just ends up being kind of tedious and abrasive and annoying. And so it came out in and it was published by the New York Times company. So the New York Times had all of this promotional power. It's a testament to how dull Voices really is, that even with coming off the back of Go Ask Alice and then being pushed by the New York Times company, it just sank like a rock. And it came out and vanished, essentially. It's still kind of around, but you don't really meet a lot of Voices fans out there.
No TV movie with William Shatner was forthcoming either on this one. But it didn't stop there. So Sparks was contacted around about the time Voices was being prepared for publication, I believe, by a fellow Mormon mother who lived just 9 miles away in Pleasant Grove, Utah. She'd seen an article in the local newspaper about a woman who appeared to be a psychologist who'd worked with children suffering from drug abuse and had prepared one girl's diary for posthumous publication to help others who might befall the same fate. And the mother told Sparks that her 16-year-old son had committed suicide and left a diary. And as you put it, Rick, she didn't want money, she didn't want fame, she didn't want attention. She just wanted her son's life to mean something, or his death would be unbearable for her. So Sparks had another diary, a cautionary tale that she could bring to the world. And this became Jay's journal, again by Anonymous, but edited by Dr. Beatrice Sparks, who also discovered the international bestseller Go Ask Alice, according to this cover. So it sort of ties into one of the other things I was going to say about the allure of Alice's diary, which is the sort of Blair Witch Project sort of sense, that posthumous found footage sort of thing that really intrigues people and draws people in. And I think that ties in well with the subject of this particular book, actually, because this one raises the stakes. This is not just about a kid dabbling in recreational drugs and slowly getting drawn deeper and deeper in. This one goes into a whole load of other topics. Rick, could you give us an overview of the kind of things that happened to Jay?
Yeah, Jay's journal, and I'm actually embarrassed to say that the Blair Witch comparison had never really occurred to me, as obvious as that is. Once you've said it, I'd never really thought about that, but it's true. And the 70s were sort of one of the early golden eras for this kind of, pseudo documentary, found footage. Is it real? Is it not? Sort of entertainment. There was a TV series called In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, and where it was, the sort of classic example is the grainy Bigfoot footage that we've all seen a million times now. And it's, they're not saying it's fake, they're not saying it's real, they're kind of saying, who knows? And the implication is, that it's probably real. And Jay's journal is sort of a sibling book to Go Ask Alice, and it came out about 8 years later. And it follows very much the same sort of pattern. It is the posthumous diary of a teenager, in this case, a teenage boy, who commits suicide after, instead of Go Ask Alice had, a teenager led astray into the world of, by drugs and by LSD. In Jay's journal, as you said, the instigating factor is Satanism, and he's sort of drawn into witchcraft and the occult and ends up committing suicide. And and it sort of goes beyond, as you noted, just Ouija boards or just kind of being intrigued by, alternative faiths or whatever. Jay's journal contains, possessed house cats and levitation, and seemingly provides an answer to the always vexing question of cattle mutilations, and all of these things that a literal demon named Raoul appearing in a teenage boy's bedroom. And it's, and it's all of this stuff that is, that you would think just on its face is, is just patently unbelievable. And yet the book is very much pushed as being a genuine, authentic diary. And, when you read it, it's simultaneously, the first time I read Jay's journal, I was an adult, but it still had this strange, and as I found out later, I understood why this was much later on. It had this strange mix of sometimes seeming a little bit more believable, seeming like an actual teenage diary. And then it would have these long stretches of just insanity where you're like, well, there's no way that this could be real or that anybody could believe it. And those two things sitting side by side were sort of puzzling until later when I, sort of discovered that there were large sections of a real diary sort of studded through this kind of insane, superstitious story. It really is. It's fascinating. And it's fascinating that book still exists and is still read and, is still embraced by a lot of people as true.
Yeah. And I was wondering what the factors were at the time that sort of drew the audiences into this one, because it's, as you say, it's a very different social landscape in America in the late 70s rather than the early 70s. I wonder if you could talk about what that is. I mean, from my perspective as a film lover, I can see the symptoms of it reflected in cinema. So, from Exorcist and The Omen and the Amityville Horror, there was a real appetite for this sense that there was an outside supernatural force attacking families in some way.
Absolutely. And I think I think certainly, I can really only speak to what it was like in the United States, but definitely there was this following the upheaval of the 60s, which had in some ways never really gone away. It had just sort of, been sublimated into all of these other, kind of social fights. And obviously we're coming off, the end of the Vietnam War and Watergate and so many of these divisive social issues. And, there's this feeling that society's in constant upheaval and turmoil. And added to that, you've got a couple of things happening. One is that, what we now call the baby boomer generation, they had in large numbers begun to drift away from the faith in which they were raised. I believe by 1978, I think it was 47% of baby boomers were no longer, they were practicing a faith that was different than the one in which they were raised. And a lot of times those were what would have at the time been called, New Age religions. And, and sometimes that can be something like Buddhism, or it can be, or it can be a sort of homegrown faith, or it can be something like Est, which is, almost more of like a self-help meets religion kind of thing. And, but those these sort of new, or at least, unusual seeming faiths, they were such anathema to so many people. And it seemed like it must be a nefarious influence. It's my son suddenly comes home and he shaved his head and he's wearing a robe and he's chanting and something has gone horribly wrong. And so there was this, somebody once said that, one of the most popular news stories you can pitch in America is this bad thing that happened is someone else's fault. And and so it's the question of what is causing this. And at the same time, there's also this constant uptick in the teenage suicide rate, especially the suicide rate among young men. And it had been climbing every single year. And, and as hard as something like drug addiction and drug abuse, that's a difficult epidemic to untangle. Teenage suicide is even harder because by definition, the people who are the direct victims are no longer around to talk about it. And families, understandably, are reluctant to sometimes dive too deep into that. If there's, if suicide happens and there's some sort of abuse or something in the family, a lot of times that's not discussed or it's covered up. Suicide notes are sometimes destroyed or withheld. And so there's this vast gray area of what is causing this. And it is part of human nature, I think, that the more complicated and troubling the problem, the more attracted we are to a simple solution, even if that solution on the face of it or in the cold light of day would seem, improbable or even impossible. When you're in the midst of some sort of crisis and somebody hands you an answer and they say, hey, this gigantic problem that is overwhelming that you cannot even begin to explain, much less solve, here's the one-line explanation for it. That's incredibly tempting for people and for societies. And Jay's journal came along and said, there's all of this stuff happening. Kids are still, rebelling and disobeying their parents, and they're into this music you don't understand, and they're following these, maybe these sorts of faiths that you don't understand. And also there's all of this fear of suicide, and I know you don't know what to do, and here's why it's happening. And it's, the answer is Satan. And it's one of those things that is, it's one of those places in history where comedy and tragedy do really overlap, because it's sort of ludicrous, and it would be purely funny if it hadn't had such horrifying, terrible real life consequences that stretched on even to today.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and we will be touching on some of those here in just a few minutes as well. But I was curious, and I haven't actually, and maybe you talked about this in the book, but I don't remember it. How did you actually first hear about or come across these books, or Alice, or whichever one you came across first?
So like a lot of people, I discovered Go Ask Alice when I was a teenager. I would have been probably 14 or so, and it was in my high school library, and it was on the just returned shelf. And it was what you saw when you came in the front door. It was over to the right, and I would always just sort of glance at it. And and the marketing did its job. I saw the cover of Go Ask Alice, and it was the cover that we now, sort of the classic Go Ask Alice cover, where it's this sort of spooky face and it's half in shadow. And then I saw those magical 5 words, which even now are a powerful lure. A real diary by Anonymous. And I was like, well, I'm going to read that. I don't know what it's about, but I'm going to read that. And I
Exactly.
took it home and I read it. And if memory serves, I think I read it twice. And I think I finished it and went back and read it again right away because it was so compelling. And and again, it was presented very much as being an authentic diary. And I even at that age, I had, and I'm certainly not alone in this, I had a real fascination, and I still do, with sort of the behind the scenes of things, how things come to be, especially if the behind the scenes aspect is meant to stay behind the scenes. You're
Yeah.
not meant to really think about it. When I was a little kid, I would go shopping with my mom, and I remember going and we would see picture frames for sale. And as a little kid, I was always fascinated by who are these people in the picture frames when you buy them.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
those are just models, but at the time I was like, well, who's this guy in this picture frame, and what does he do when he's not when he's not posing for picture frames? Like, who is this person? Or
Right.
you'd hear what we called elevator music, which is sort of like an orchestral version of Ruby Tuesday or something. And I think, well, whose job is it to go and play the oboe on this orchestral version of a Rolling Stones song? Like, who does that for a living? And I'm always interested in
Yeah.
things like that. And so as I got older, I thought about Go Ask Alice, and about, the idea of when, I would ask somebody, when I read Go Ask Alice the first time, I remember asking a friend of mine, I said, oh, I read that book, Go Ask Alice. I said, well, who really wrote that? And she's like, well, it's anonymous. And I said, yeah, but who really wrote it? Like, who is anonymous? And she said, well, and she spoke to me as though I was a not terribly bright child. She said, well, nobody knows. That's why it's anonymous. And I thought, later on, I was like, well, somebody somewhere knows. I mean, somebody's name is on a piece of paper somewhere for this book to exist. And
For
it
sure.
kind of stayed with me. And later in my 20s, I heard about Jay's journal, although I hadn't read it, but I read Jay's journal. And then, at that point, I did not yet know that they both traced back to the same person. And, much less, I mean, I read one book in high school, one book 20 years later, and they both, they were both powerful in their own way. But then when I learned that they both came from the same place, which is this giant house with blood red walls on the outskirts of Provo, Utah. I mean, at that point, I was like all in. I mean, there's just no going back. I was like, I have to, however long this takes, I have to figure out what's happening here. Anyway, that's a long way of saying I had the classic Go Ask Alice arc, and then I discovered Jay's journal about a decade later.
Nice. So, and I was gonna put this up. So this is your book that you wrote, and it came out in 2022, and it goes all in on this whole story. And Conrad and I both read this book, and I just think it was really so interesting. And we won't cover all. There's no spoilers here. I'm not going to give away like the stuff that Rick uncovered, but I highly recommend this book because it's so interesting to the point where like you're reading it. Conrad and I were texting each other as we were reading it. And it's like, oh my God, like, have you gotten to this part yet? And I'm like, no, I'm not there yet. I'm almost there. So it's just, it really is like, and we've never had a guest on this show before, but I had to bring a guest on just to kind of talk about this because it was so like, it went exactly where I would have gone if I were writing this book. Not that I could write a book, but I'm just saying if I were able to do so, it answered like all the questions that I had about it. Like, what were the motivations? What were some of the other ripple effects and that sort of thing? And that's why I think it really does put this whole thing in context and give it a bigger perspective than just the original story, which is crazy, which is that a Mormon housewife just made up these diaries and kind of passed them off as real. I mean, the Jay's journal thing really goes above and beyond, in my opinion, what happened with the Go Ask Alice, because it's a real person and a real family that was impacted by all of this. And so we'll get to who all of these people really are in just a moment. But really quickly, I think we need to talk about Beatrice, our friend Beatrice that we keep mentioning, who wrote these books. She was born in 1917. So by the time Go Ask Alice was being published, she was in her 50s, I think is correct?
She was 54 when Unmasked Alice came out.
Okay. And so I don't really know. I know she had sort of an interesting background. She was born in Idaho. She moved to Logan, Utah. She was a Mormon. She wanted to be a writer. She sort of wrote for all sorts of different things throughout her earlier life, like church publications and different, anywhere really that would publish her stuff. And she would sort of do writing for hire, like writing about all sorts of, I couldn't tell if it was like ad copy or if it was just sort of, I know at one point she was doing this, the Family Achievement Institute, which is how she came in contact with Art Linkletter. So tell me a little bit about that.
So as you said, yeah, Beatrice Sparks, she's, she had a fascinating life. She was, as you said, she was born in a tent near some railroad tracks in a mining camp in this, it wasn't even really a town. It was just this sort of ad hoc kind of gathering of miners in the sort of wilderness of Idaho. And she grew up in Cache County, Utah, in Logan. And she had, a pretty tumultuous adolescence. And then by the time Unmasked Alice came out, she had been, really struggling, as a writer for more than 30 years. She'd really been trying to break through, and she lived in Los Angeles, and she'd made, she had a lot of connections, and she'd basically written for any place she could get published. I mean, Beatrice Sparks certainly has what we would call a multifaceted personality, but I will say that, she did have motivation, she had persistence, she had drive, which nothing got in her way and nothing slowed her down, and for good and for bad. And she wrote for any place that she could write. She wrote she worked for a while with Joseph Barbera of the Hanna-Barbera cartoon empire. He published a series of comic books that she scripted. She did an advice column for teenage girls, this advice column called Girl to Girl. And she wrote for local newspapers. And then later on, once she had returned to Utah and she was living in Provo, she wrote for, so the Provo, among other things, is more or less the world capital, certainly the U.S. capital of multi-level marketing companies, which is, where it's like you kind of corner your friends in the kitchen at a party. You're like, would you like to buy these plastic spoons or whatever it is? And it's, you have to buy them and then resell them, and then it's not really a pyramid scheme, but it's kind of shaped like a pyramid scheme. And it's, there's a lot of those come out of Provo. And the Family Achievement Institute was such a company, and what they basically sold was, they sold you the right to then sell to your friends and neighbors a lot of vinyl records featuring these sort of recorded stories and sort of verbal essays and like advice about how to raise a happy, successful, wholesome child, and and so it was a lot of like heartwarming anecdotes and let me tell you the story of whatever, and then it would be some story narrated by Pat Boone or somebody, and and so they needed ghostwriters for this to crank this material out. And one of the people who ended up getting a ghostwriting job was Beatrice Sparks, because one of the narrators for the Family Achievement Institute, and he was also the public face in their advertisements, was Art Linkletter. And when I talk about Art Linkletter now, the way I think in the book I describe him as being sort of like a national dad, but he's sort of, Tom Hanks is maybe the closest equivalent we've got now, where it's somebody that just everyone seems to love. Everyone seems to like. And, and he had been in movies and on television and the radio, but it was more, at that point, he was just famous because he was just this guy that everybody just kind of loved and trusted. And he also put his name on a whole lot of products. The original, the board game, The Game of Life, that was a thing that Art Linkletter, got made and helped to advertise it. And he was one of the narrators for this Family Achievement Institute. And that is how Beatrice Sparks made the connection with him. And she never forgot a contact, and she never, and she was not shy about it either. To her credit, I suppose, when she had an idea, or if she thought you could help her, you would hear from her, and you'd hear from her again, and you'd hear from her a third time, over and over. And so she remained in contact with Art Linkletter, which then, in kind of the worst possible way, paid off a couple of years later when his daughter committed suicide, and he stopped being such a nice, friendly, warm guy and became a real anti-drug warrior, a real like fire-breathing zealot in the drug war, and became for a while became a wholly different person, and really was trying to find any avenue to to kind of strike back at this drug menace that he saw as having killed his daughter, and that's when Beatrice Sparks magically arrived back in the story, and with something that he was with a story that he was almost guaranteed to be interested in.
Yeah, and I couldn't, when I was reading about Diane Linkletter and her suicide, that his idea was that she had taken LSD at some point in the distant past, and that she had had a flashback, and that is what caused her to become disoriented and jump out of her sixth-story window. And then, I have to think that on some level, a lot of these, drug-induced people getting, really high and jumping out of windows, which was such an urban legend. And in the 80s, we saw it in like Lethal Weapon opens with it. There's also a TV movie called Desperate Lives that has Helen Hunt as a teenager, or an early 20s person acting like a teenager, like do some sort of drug and jump through a glass and like land on the ground. It's very dramatic. You can find it on YouTube. So there's a lot of that we all believed, like in the 80s, that, oh, if you ever do acid, you'll think you can fly and jump out of a window, just like left and right. And so that myth, it was very pervasive, I think. I'm almost surprised it's not in Go Ask Alice.
It's worth noting actually that in the original manuscript, the original draft of Go Ask Alice, or one of the early drafts before it was published, there was actually a little there was a reference to their not jumping out a window, but there was a reference specifically to in the editor's note at the end, where it says, the author of this diary died 2 weeks after her last entry, or 3 weeks after her last entry, whatever it says, and the original draft said something about perhaps it was a flashback, which was very specifically, that is exactly what Art Linkletter with the Linkletter family thought. And that was taken out prior to publication, maybe because it was a little too on the nose. It was a little too similar to Diane Linkletter. But you're definitely right that that is, all the way up through, if memory serves, I believe that when the sort of infamous videotaped beating of Rodney King happened in 1990, 91, I believe that one of the early defenses that the LAPD gave, one of their sort of justifications for this, was that, well, we thought he was all jacked up on that PCP that makes you superhuman. So drugs having the ability to just do whatever the story conveniently needs them to do seems to be a pervasive thing even now. I'm sure there's some different version of that happening now with probably some different version of some different drug.
Right.
But yeah, and it definitely, it wasn't helped by the fact that LSD had been declared a Schedule I drug along with heroin and marijuana, which meant that you couldn't do any research, you couldn't do any studying, you couldn't do any clinical testing of it. So there was really no way to disprove any of these claims about LSD. So if somebody said, if you take LSD once, you're insane, or if somebody talks about flashbacks, or somebody talks about how, it stays in your system for 7 years, maybe not. There was no way to know, because it was actually illegal to do any research on it. So you could kind of make any claim you wanted about LSD.
Yeah, it's true. And honestly, I remember constantly hearing about angel dust, PCP. There's a really funny line in the movie Trading Places about it, where that is what he's accused of selling. It was
Frank
angel dust, PCP.
Yeah. I can picture that. Good reference. You get many bonus points for that. Cyclidine, PCP, angel dust.
You just don't hear about PCP anymore.
You don't. You really don't.
Not a lot of high school kids in the 80s were doing PCP. I think that was more of a biker thing, but you always heard that any drug could be laced with angel dust. You freak out, jump out of a window. Was that true in England, by the way, Conrad? Were you hearing these stories, or was it just us over here?
No, I think in England we were leading a much more sheltered life.
You didn't have the did you have the week and a half long bath salts panic that happened here?
Oh, right.
I don't know if that's a thing people still talk about now, but there was like it
I
was like
do.
a day and a half or something where everybody was just like bath salts, and it was like I had no. And by
Yeah.
the time I figured it out, it was like that was gone. So
Yeah. That'll turn you
Oh,
into a zombie. It's amazing.
yeah.
But
No, all we had was Mr. Matey, and so I don't think that had the same effect.
no, probably not. Well, so I think going into who were these people really. Now, I know we're not going to go into in this show who we think Alice might be, because Rick has done a tremendous amount of research and has some thoughts and some evidence that he's dug up. But going around that, in terms of how she's depicted in the original book, how much do you, I mean, we've kind of already talked about how much we think that she pulled from the Diane Linkletter story. Like, do you think that that was it seems like it was very intentional to me. Like, she saw an opportunity because she's so desperate to get something published, and she was like, she justifies it maybe to herself by saying this could really help a lot of people. But I mean, I'm filling all of that in. Like, is that sort of what you take away, having read all of these original source
I
documents?
mean, there is definitely a connection to Diane Linkletter. I mean, there's no. I mean, and Sparks herself said as much. She did interviews where people would because through the end of but through the end of her life, she wrote or discovered or produced or edited, depending on what account
Sure.
you believe. She had all of these other sort of teenage diaries and so forth. But people would always ask her about Go Ask Alice, and she would freely say, well, around this time, Art Linkletter's daughter Diane, committed suicide while under the influence of LSD, and so I felt it was important to. And the connection was actually so clear that if you read, there are actually early reviews of Go Ask Alice that you can find where they flat out say, they assume, in other words, they flat out say, like, this seems to be modeled on Diane Linkletter, or,
Right.
this was inspired by the story of Diane Linkletter and other teenagers who have fallen victim, to the drug plague or whatever. So that was a very clear, it was a very straight line there. And also, if you just were to lay one over the other, I mean, it is so similar in so many ways, and she had been pushing so hard to try to break through as a writer. There's also something that so many things had to get cut for length in this book, which is unfortunate. It's one of those, which is why you have an editor, because it's like left to my own devices, I would have kept everything in and the book would have been 10,000 pages long and nobody ever would have read it. But one of the things that I did really regret having to trim for length was the very last thing that Diane Linkletter did professionally before she died, her last project was, and these don't really exist much anymore, but it was a spoken word recording. It was a spoken word single. And, up through, I think, the 90s, you would occasionally have a spoken word recording that became sort of a pop hit somehow. And whether it was Desiderata in the 70s or whether it was that everybody's free to wear sunscreen thing in the 90s, it was, you would have these sort of freakish hits that were just recordings of just people talking. And the very last thing that Diane Linkletter recorded before she died was something she recorded with her dad, with Art Linkletter. And it was a 45 single called Dear Mom and Dad / We Love You Call Collect. And it was sort of a riff a little bit on the Beatles' She's Leaving Home. What it is it's a spoken word conversation back and forth between a father, played by Art Linkletter, and a daughter, played by Diane Linkletter. And she plays a runaway and he plays a worried father. And it cuts back and forth, and you hear his half of basically what he's thinking at home, where he's thinking, your mother and I are just worried. We hope we didn't drive you away, wherever you are. We hope you know that we love you and that you are safe, and please come home. And then it cuts to her writing a letter home, and she's saying, Dear Mom and Dad, I hope you're not too worried. I just had to get away because you didn't understand me and what I'm going through. And now I'm living with some kids and we're all, helping each other out, and life is groovy and all of this. And it was this back and forth between a daughter who has run away and has presumably fallen in with the bad crowd and the worried father. And so they recorded this, and then it came out just a few weeks after Diane Linkletter died, which was, this sort of horribly fortuitous timing. And that was not Art Linkletter's decision, by the way. That was the record label's decision to put it out. And it sold like 500,000 copies and I think won a Grammy. And that was in And that was shortly before Beatrice Sparks approached Art Linkletter with,
Hmm.
surprise, the diary of a teenage girl who dies after taking LSD. And so it is inconceivable to me that that recording also did not kind of underscore to her the idea that this is a story that he is primed to believe and very receptive to believe, and that he will help to market.
And you see that actually in Go Ask Alice,
Definitely.
for sure. But like I said before, the most troubling part of all of this is the Jay's Journal tie-in. And Conrad, you're going to tell us a little bit about who Jay really is.
Yes, which I don't think is too much of a spoiler for the book, because I think this is something that is generally out there, public knowledge, which is that the original source for some elements of Jay's journal was Alden Barrett, who was born on the 4th of September 1954 in Pleasant Grove, Utah. And his parents were Doyle and Marcella Barrett. And he was the first of three children born to the couple. But the family also had three older children from Marcella's first marriage. And after his death, Marcella heard about Go Ask Alice and reached out to Beatrice to share his diary, trying to give meaning to Alden's life, as we mentioned before. And again, just talking about that sense of a parent just confused, trying to find a reason, trying to find some sort of understanding about what has happened here, and in a very vulnerable position. And Beatrice took the real diary and added a number of additional entries about Satanism and published it as Jay's journal. I mean, the amount of additional material is really quite striking, and it's odd because when you hit the real entries, and here's one example of a handful. I think it's only sort of, is it about 20, Rick, that are actually real?
It's about 24 of his entries, and then and then something like 191 additional, brand new entries. But yeah, he's of the 212 entries in Jay's journal. I think 24 are his.
Yeah, it's not a huge amount. Now, I believe you've read Alden's diary and spoken to his
Yes.
family and friends. What was the general sense that you got of who Alden really was?
I think Alden was. I think I think he was. He was a smart and gifted, young man who also had, his challenges and was not perfect. He, I think, had been born in, the wrong time and place, honestly. He very much, at one point, he literally writes in his diary about the struggle of, because Pleasant Grove, even now, is heavily, Mormon, heavily Latter-day Saint, and it's extremely conservative. I mean, I think by most estimates, I think Utah County, which is so Pleasant Grove, and is basically an adjunct of Provo, which is right near Brigham Young University. So it is very much the sort of spiritual center of Utah, and in some ways the political center of Utah. I think it's generally considered the most conservative county in the nation's most conservative state. And he writes really openly at one point about the struggle of trying to be liberal in this ultra conservative atmosphere, and that he was looking for, as referenced in sort of something we were talking about earlier, he was looking for some sort of spirituality or a spiritual connection that he didn't find in the Latter Day Saint Church. He didn't find in being a Mormon, and that he wanted to, like so many teenagers, he of every era, he was just like, I want to get out of this town, and I want to go someplace where people are different, and where I can sort of be my own person, and which is a very common thing. He also had struggled with drug addiction, substance abuse, and he was almost, I am not a psychologist, and this is only my speculation, but he was almost certainly clinically depressed. I mean, he definitely struggled with depression and mental upset, and that was all in an era when those things were not even really talked about, and there was certainly not the infrastructure to deal with them. I mean, even now, those are tricky things, especially when it comes to teenagers. But then there was almost nothing. I think when Alden died, I think I think the first real serious study on adolescent mental health had only been published a few months earlier, and there was only one of them. So
Yeah.
they had only barely started addressing that. And, and he also just had, he had this very, he had this relationship with a young woman that he went to high school with, a girl named Teresa, and they had, that relationship that so many people kind of go through when they're a teenager, where it's, you are instantly in love with this person, and they are instantly the center of your life, and you are going to spend every moment together, and you are going to live happily ever after. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. But when you add all of that stuff together, it just, for lots of reasons, it just kind of became more than he was able to deal with. And so, as you noted, he ended up committing suicide, when he was 16 and a half.
Yeah. Now, the diary gives a very different explanation of what you've described there, which is a very complex situation with many, many factors that make it very, very difficult to understand. Instead, it just goes straight for the Satanism route. How much evidence did you find in Alden Barrett's actual diary of a descent into a terrifying world of the occult?
I will say, and I don't even think it's in his diary. I think this is from an interview with one of his friends. I mean, about the most you can say is that, and this does actually dovetail with something we were talking about earlier. It's hard to, I think it's hard, and I certainly was not alive at that time, but I think it's hard to imagine a period when somebody talking about meditating or having a mantra, or somebody, wanting to pursue, sort of, like trying to be Zen about things, with the idea that when that would have been scandalous or even seen as sort of a destructive and evil influence. I mean, one of the things I should say about Alden Barrett is that he clearly was, when I say he was born in the wrong place, that's because it was such a conservative, ultra-religious town. He was also born in the wrong time because he was at heart, a flower child. I mean, he was a hippie. There's just that's how he would have described himself. And you could see, I mean, when he ran away from home in 1970, and he ran to the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, which at that point he only knew about from glimpses on television and in the news. And it seemed like this flower child paradise, this place of peace and love, and and where everybody got along, and you could have this sort of mellow, laid back existence, which of course is not what it really was, but that's something he desperately wanted. He was at heart, like I said, there's just no way around it, he was a flower child. And so part of that became exploring these sort of Eastern faiths, or these other ways of approaching things, and the idea that that there's something beyond the sort of spirituality he'd been handed from birth. I'm sort of getting off the point here, but I will say that at one point, this is the 1970s in the suburbs, so there were definitely nights where Alden and a bunch of his friends would end up in somebody's basement with like wood paneling on the walls, and like a Jimi Hendrix record playing, and somebody would bring out the Ouija board, and
Sure.
and they would sit around asking it questions. But Alden Barrett, one of his friends told me that he said, like, Alden just thought the Ouija board was just hokey. He just thought it was just a bunch of nonsense, and he just considered that's just sort of like a parlor game. I think, like most people. At one point he writes, he at school, he along with some other sort of like-minded friends, he joined this group. I think it was an acronym, and I honestly don't know what the acronym stood for, but it was Karma, and it was all caps, Karma, and it stood for something or other. And it was just this idea of thinking about the symbolism of your dreams, and thinking about is there such a thing as a past life, and does reincarnation really exist? And all of that, now that just seems, it seems innocuous, but back then that was seen as an evil, destructive influence. And Beatrice Sparks actually, at one point, how do I put this? So at one point there was a member of Beatrice Sparks's family who had begun to explore Zen Buddhism. And Beatrice Sparks wrote this member of her family, a long, long letter. And the opening words of the letter are, "Satan is trying to deceive you." And because Beatrice Sparks herself absolutely equated something like Buddhism with Satan. The idea that it wasn't Satanism per se, but it was this sort of shiny object that Satan was waving to lead you off the
Right.
path of righteousness. And so when she found out that Alden Barrett had played with a Ouija board and was also sitting in a, cross-legged and chanting a mantra, she immediately, in her mind had the conclusion, aha, I know why he's doing this. And it is because he's been led astray by the great Dark Lord.
I think it's an
Yes.
important point because, when you hear just the high level story that there was this teenage boy, he, died by suicide. It's very tragic. He left a diary. His mother reached out to someone to try to, help other kids, other parents, all this kind of stuff. And then she slaps the Satanism thing on it. The first thing that I'm thinking is, well, she's just doing that because Satanism is a hot topic. But I don't know that Satanism was yet a hot topic. And I do think that what you're saying is probably more accurate, which is she's reading his diary through the lens of someone born in 1917 as a very conservative Mormon person who is, very religious. And so
Definitely.
she sees the world very differently. And so she does see Satanism. And so probably, I'm not saying it's okay, but I'm saying in her mind, she probably didn't think it was as much of a stretch as we do when we look at what was in his diary, his actual diary.
And she was certainly not alone. I mean, there's a reason why that story sort of found purchase with a lot of people, because there was, especially I think in that generation, there was I think if you had polled most Americans of her age at that time, they would have at the very least looked askance at something, like Buddhism or meditation. And it should also be noted that one of the reasons, and I realize I didn't to be very clear about this, I never discovered one shred or iota of evidence of any kind at all, in any way, supporting the idea that he was a Satanist or was drawn to any sort of black magic or witchcraft or whatever. Again, aside from sort of sitting around in a basement with some friends and talking about, what if, and just sort of doing, kind of just brainstorming the way that teenagers do. I never found any evidence of that. And I do think you are correct about that. It is absolutely a generational thing to the extent that, by most accounts, the way that he first learned about the idea of a mantra and meditation was through the Beatles, because the Beatles had gone and George Harrison certainly had remained a convert, to meditation for life. And, and even, apart from John Lennon, the other Beatles even sort of, espoused its benefits. And that was actually the way that a lot of Western people first heard about those concepts, was via the Beatles. And he was a Beatles fanatic. And, but of course, that was also the time when the Beatles, to a lot of older people, the Beatles were, they were the band that said they were bigger than Jesus. They were
Devil music.
Exactly. They were leading young people astray. So that probably did not help his case.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think, he's not a Satanist in the way that we think of the word today, but probably through Beatrice Sparks' eyes, there's some glimmer of that as was a reality to her. So I think that, it's important. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but just kind of talking about the damage that this sort of, because in this book, it's a diary. So it's a diary, Jay's journal. And so it's presenting all of these things as being real things that happened. So, pencils levitating in a cafe, in front of a bunch of other people, and, possessed house cats and all the stuff that you're talking about. I don't know how much you can sort of believe that that's just what he's perceiving, or if people, I assume people are literally thinking that these things happened and that it's true and it's the devil. So because of that, and then, there were a ton of other things that happened, and I'm just going to kind of go through several things. And Conrad, I'm going to come back at the end to the impact to the actual family, but in a broader sense, things that happened were things like lots of people getting accused of being Satanists. So you've got the Kern County child abuse, all the daycare child abuse scandals of the 80s, the McMartin preschool trial, and then, of course, the West Memphis Three. These are tons and tons of people who were sent to prison for many, many years. Some, like Damien Eccles, were put on death row for being for being Satanists. It's mind blowing to think of that this wasn't that long ago, and it happened like in my lifetime, that people really believed that all of this was legitimately true. You have Procter and Gamble being accused of being a Satanist company because of the way that their logo had been designed for many, many years. So much so, people were boycotting them in the 80s, and they had to change their logo. You had kids who were into D&D, like James Dallas Egbert III, who you do talk a bit about in your book, who sadly also died by suicide, but was into D&D. And then the novel and then the TV movie Mazes and Monsters came out, the movie coming out in 1982 with Tom Hanks, who we mentioned earlier. And then we had, again, with Dungeons and Dragons, we had BADD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, the parental group that, were trying to really warn everyone about how demonic and evil Dungeons and Dragons was for children. And you talked about a really interesting thing that I had never heard of, which is this Wasatch D&D club that got shut down in a school. These kids were having a cool after school program that allowed them to have some way of interacting with each other if they weren't super athletic. And then the parents swoop in and they're like, no. And then, of course, my favorite, which I have to put in here, which is, the back in control. This is from the Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, the metal years. And you have, this woman who does these back in control metal deprogramming centers where they basically bring these kids in, they take all their metal t-shirts and tapes and, all this stuff and destroy it. Like as though it's a cult, and they do sort of describe it as a gang and a cult in this crazy booklet that they put out and sent out to parents. So, it was like there was something in the water, and people were just going crazy about it. It was like the Salem witch trials on like a massive scale. So yeah, I just think it's mind blowing, and people who are younger who didn't live through it, I think it may be hard to understand how crazy the climate was about this.
First of all, you gave me a strange flashback with that Decline of Western Civilization screenshot. I believe her name is Darlene Petanicchio.
It is. It is.
That's, as you can tell, I wasted most of my adolescence and 20s, just watching that movie repeatedly.
Same.
But it is one of those things that, the same thing where it's like, I lived through it, and it is still mind-boggling. I mean, when you think about, when the Satanic Panic happened, it's like 15 years after we went to the moon. It's like the modern era. It is, it's like, we discovered science by that point. We sort of knew about, and yet, and I'm sure everybody has a story like this. When I went to a public high school, but I remember at least once when I was, I don't know, maybe a junior, they did this thing where they brought all of us in my class into this sort of big lecture hall building we had, and they brought in, local, like members of the local police force, these cops who came in, and so they're government employees with guns,
right,
standing there, and they're telling us as though it is just an irrefutable fact that packs of Satanists, teenage and otherwise, are lurking everywhere in my small, dusty little town. And I don't want to ascribe like too much intelligence to my teenage self. It's always tempting to sort of, as somebody once said, I forget who it was. Somebody once said that it's always tempting to view your teenage self as just like a smaller version of your current self, with all that, the same knowledge. But there was this moment of sort of cultural vertigo in the Satanic Panic where, I think, to me in any way, looking back at the Satanic Panic, one of the most unnerving things about it retrospectively, and I think at the time, was this sort of creeping realization that adults who are supposed to be, even if you don't always get along with adults and you don't always get along with parents and teachers, there is this recognition that's like, okay, well, they're adults and they're in charge and they are responsible for kind of keeping society running and on an even keel, and they're You know, they're the ones who are supposed to keep us safe and to know what's what. And kind of seeing them fall into believing just this patently,
Mhm.
ludicrous nonsense. And it was a kind of a terrifying thing to go through, this seeing your parents or the authority figures in your life start to behave like crazy destructive children, and the realization that, like, oh, parents and teachers and other authority figures, including ones with guns who are standing in front of me, in this lecture hall, they cannot always be trusted to do the right or even the rational, sane thing. They sometimes believe and act on, destructive nonsense. And that's really a destabilizing feeling when you realize that the authority figures in your life sometimes not only don't know what they're talking about, they believe in things that are literally impossible. And they want
Yeah.
you to, and they are acting accordingly. And that's a really unnerving place to be as a young person, as a child.
Yeah, I think back then it has to be said, because now we have the internet. People, I think, are trained to be a little more um, skeptical, I think, about things that they read. I think at least a lot of us are, more than we used to be. Back in the 80s, I do feel like parents especially would, if they checked a book out from the library, then it's legitimate. If it's on the news, it's legitimate and it really happened. Like, they just believed it because it's on the news. Well, I saw it on the news, so it's true. And they would just pass it around by word of mouth. And these stories, like, that is the danger, I think, of these types of, books that come out and things that were happening back then, because people would read it and go, well, it got published, so it must have been fact checked and it must be true. And, well, if you let your kid listen to that devil music, then they will kill themselves, and and they just believe it.
Hmm. Definitely. I mean, and I mean, on more than one occasion, I should say that, my mother is no longer like this, but my mother did go through a period of being extremely religious and it coincided with when I was a teenager, because there
Hmm.
was, she was sort of stuck in this sort of horrible failing marriage, and was desperately trying to, like, keep her family together, and so she just kept doubling down on kind of some of the more extreme elements of her Christian faith. But I would come home and all my Alice Cooper and Kiss records would be in the trash,
Oh
and
no.
which she has apologized for many times, in recent years. But I would come home and it was like, where were my records going? It's like they were out on the curb because somebody in her prayer group had said, well, Kiss stands for Knights in Satan's Service.
Yes,
And
everybody said that.
of course, and it's in a book, and they couldn't publish it if it wasn't true.
Right.
And so it just became, and as you said, it became this thing, and it became an easy answer. And if you are already hungry for that answer and predisposed maybe to think
Yes.
outside the bounds of what is provable, it's not, it is one of those things that once you get outside of that bubble, you ask yourself, how could anybody possibly believe this? But I think, it's sort of, as somebody said, when you're in the painting, you can't always see the painting. And there was a whole generation there where adults just, it all just seemed incredibly plausible to them, either to the point of, as you said, sending people to death row for 25 years,
Right.
which, I mean, I should point out that, I mean, just at least like maybe 2 years ago or something now, there was a survey done by the Public Religious Research Institute, I believe they're called, and they are, by all accounts, a fairly reputable organization in terms of surveys. But they did this survey of the United States, I think in 2021, 2022, and the numbers were higher for Republicans than Democrats, but still, across all Americans, across all groups
Hmm.
surveyed, I think something like 22% of surveyed adults in the US said that they believed that the United States government, media, and financial systems were controlled by Satan worshiping pedophiles. That is 1 in 5 people, like 3 years ago. And
Yeah.
even if it's quote only half that number, that
Hmm.
is seriously alarming. And so a lot of these ideas have never, Mick Jagger one time said that he said there's no present, there's just recycled past. And I feel a lot of these
Yes.
fears, whether it's QAnon or anything like that, as we've seen in the last decade, these things don't go away. They just surface again with a new paint job, and people buy
That's
it all
right.
over again.
That's right. It is all kind of the same recycled thing. And, it leads to such destruction. I know that, like, Alden's family had to deal with so much backlash because his identity was not super hidden. Like, even though his name is not stated in Jay's journal, I feel like some of the details were close enough that a lot of people who knew him, right, Conrad?
Absolutely.
Like, I mean,
Yeah, they were able to put two and two together. Beatrice, as you describe it, Rick, did not do the best job of anonymizing
No.
the sources. And what's really sad, or what I found the most troubling when reading your book was trying to imagine the perspective of the family who hand over this diary to Beatrice, don't hear anything for a very long time, and then they hear from somebody in the street in their town, oh, there's a book out about your son, and they didn't know anything about it, and then they read it, and it's just orgies of blood and cattle mutilation and goodness knows what else, and it's totally unrecognizable. And then they start, their son becomes sort of like the town boogeyman almost, to the point where now if you speak to people about who he was, there's just this general sense of him being this sort of dark, scary figure without any sense of what the details might have been, and to the point where even his headstone has been vandalized so frequently over the years that most of his portrait is no longer visible. And it's I think that's probably the bit where you really start, even though you think, okay, Beatrice maybe elaborated upon the journal's fabricated things, but it wasn't necessarily rooted in sensationalism for the sake of profit. It possibly was rooted in a genuine fear she had about the outside forces that could be leading kids astray. But then you look at the genuine damage that she did to a real family, and it made me feel very, very. It made it difficult to sympathize with her. Let's put it that way.
It is this sort of escalating series of, choices and deceptions, and as you said, it is one of those things that, Go Ask Alice. Whatever anyone thinks of Go Ask Alice, sometimes people, when I talk about this book, they'll say like, well, Go Ask Alice, has it done more harm than good, or is there any reason for, and the one thing I can say about Go Ask Alice, I mean, that's certainly there's, it's a bit of a fraught book and a fraught discussion, but I can say that Go Ask Alice, whatever else anybody wants to say about it, it has indisputably saved lives. I mean, Go Ask Alice there are people who either got sober or stayed sober because of Go Ask Alice. And I profile a couple of them sort of later in the book. That doesn't excuse the fact that, if something is being pushed as real when it's not, because that has its own sort of deleterious effects. But at the same time, the collateral damage was, if not non-existent, was, amorphous. It was hard to pin down. There weren't real people being harmed. Jay's journal, where, as you said, there's this real life teenage boy who, was certainly not perfect, but seemed to be good-hearted and was trying to make his way through a difficult period of his life in a difficult place at a difficult time. And, and sadly, committed suicide, and his family is already sort of dealing with this, and I'm trying not to make the book sound relentlessly bleak, because I try to make it engaging and even some moments of sort of grim humor to kind of leaven it. But, one of the things that happens again and again in this book is, the idea of what the dynamic is in a family when a child is suicidal or in fact does commit suicide, and that that can be, an incredibly, not just destabilizing, but that can be a real, seismic shift in everybody's family, and it can lead to all kinds of terrible things. So the family's already trying to deal with this horror of their son having committed suicide, and this guilt that, like, well, is it our fault? We didn't save him. We didn't do enough to protect him. And then a decade later, he is, as you said, sort of, recast as this teenage satanic psychopath, and in a way that is both unbelievable and yet readily identifiable and recognizable to anybody in that town who knows the family, and even if they don't. And so now the family has to contend with their son being recast as this kind of Satan incarnate. And so I mean, and I should say, I don't have kids, so I cannot even really adequately imagine this guilt of now for the second time, we have failed to protect our son, because now he has almost been taken from us in a sort of existential sense, not just physically, but now his memory has actually been stolen from us and pilloried in public. And, and there's this guilt of like, now what have we done? What have we failed him again? And it is, it's one of those things that is, as you said, it becomes increasingly difficult to find any sort of justification. And by the end of the book, I think, as you said, it's an indefensible series of choices, however you look at it.
It is, and it's hard to wrap your head around how Beatrice could have justified it to herself. Like, she had to be aware of, like, even if you didn't know for like she had children. I don't have kids either, but I can only imagine how devastating that had to be for their family. So like, I can't imagine saying something so heinous about a child like that. Like,
and especially when you consider, and this is something I talk about early on in the book, that Beatrice Sparks' own first child died very young, died in infancy. And so she had gone through that herself. Again, and this is just speculation on my part. I don't want to speak too directly to this, but I will say that, if you read a lot of her other writing and a lot of her personal correspondence and things, one of the things that you'll find, because Beatrice Sparks was a member of that Great Depression generation, and she and her later husband, they both gone through a lot of truly awful, horrifying things, and her family had kind of come apart, and then the depression had just flattened everything, and then she had to drop out of school and move away from home and all of this, and so she had endured a lot of things. And when she wrote about that period later on, when she wrote about the Great Depression, a thing that she returned to again and again in her sort of in her letters or in her just essays, her things that are genuinely nonfiction, the thing that she hits again and again and again is how you had to be strong to survive, and if you were weak, you were just going to get rolled over. And she actually, in one of her nonfiction books, a book called Key to Happiness, which is this self-help book, she writes about the Great Depression, and she says, when the Great Depression happened, she said, I'm paraphrasing from memory now, but she says something like, when the Great Depression happened, weak men just laid down and died. And so, that's a theme of hers a lot, the idea that weakness is a sin, that if you are, in other words, if you're weak, you kind of, you are, that is a huge failing for her. If you are perceived to be weak, and if you perceived to be a person who can't persevere, because she persevered. And I think the idea, seeing suicide, I think that was, coupled with all of the other, he's pursuing, Buddhism and all of these things that seem evil and wicked to her. And it culminates in what she viewed as the ultimate act of weakness, which is suicide. And my take, and this is only my take, is that, committing suicide would just earn her sort of eternal contempt, that right. Immediately made you somebody that she herself had no sympathy for. That is my read on that.
Wow. I mean, I can see that.
It's a theme that recurs throughout a lot of her writing, the idea of persevering versus giving up. And, she was very, even in her personal correspondence, I mean, I think I described her at one point as having her tone as sometimes as being like an angry bluebird, where she was sort of like really cheerful, but like in a kind of an angry way, or she was angry like in a cheerful way. She was like this really perpetual, like this angry camp counselor that was like wanting you to be the best you could be, but was like shouting at you to make it happen. It was just sort of, and I think a lot of that comes through in, in her characters and how they unfold.
Yeah, this whole story, as I was reading it, one of the first things that came to my mind when we talk about things like biographies being fraudulent and all sorts of literary fraud, there are a bunch of books that come up, and I just kind of want to touch on them. The first one that came out for me was A Million Little Pieces. I'm sure people compare this a lot by James Fry. And if you were around in the 90s and aughts, like there was the whole expose where the author had gone on Oprah. She promoted the book. Then it came out through an article that it was all, embellished heavily. It wasn't completely false, but it was very embellished. And so she brought him back on the show. I also up here have Michelle Remembers, which came out a couple years, I think, after Jay's Journal, which was a Canadian, sort of the Canadian version, where it's, a woman having all of these past memories that, of being in the satanic cult thing. And she also was on Oprah. So there's a lot of talk show stuff. A couple of these others are more recent, including JT Leroy, which, isn't exactly the same thing, but it is sort of like, you're selling books through this character that you've created, but the real author is someone completely different, who is writing about a life, a struggle that they personally are just imagining. They don't have any personal experience with it. And then, of course, Benjamin, I can't pronounce that, but that person claiming to have survived concentration camp. So really heinous things that people say, lay claim to. And, it's almost like, is there some sort of psychology that all of these people have in common? They seem to all be really fairly, I don't want to use the word like privileged people, but people who definitely have not been through the level of trauma that they're writing about. And then they kind of appropriate traumas that are suffered by real people for their own benefit. And it just sort of comes across as particularly awful when you're talking about something that real people have lived through, with the exception of, I think, the whole satanic stuff gets a little bit imaginary. But some of these other things are very much things that people did live through. Like, I just wonder at what makes someone feel like they can do that? I just can't. I don't know.
One of the things that one of the other things that got cut out of the book for length was I actually had a whole chapter about James Fry's appearance on Oprah, and which is, I think the phrase I use is that something like, she reduces him to literary gruel, on camera,
Yes,
which
she does.
although to be fair, I think at the time when that happened, I think that was in 2006, and there was this sense of like, okay, well, it's a new era of truth and memoirs. There will be no more of these fictitious autobiographies. And of course, in the 10 years after that, I think a dozen memoirs, something like that, were pulled for being essentially just fabricated, including one, I believe there was in fact a memoir called Misha, which is about a young woman literally raised by wolves.
Right.
And they were like, seems legitimate, let's publish it. And this term emerged in the late 90s and the aughts, this term called misery lit. And it was the idea of, again, it was this person who managed to persevere through this terrible, horrible story that is so, that is so dark and perverse, you can't even imagine it. But now they're here to tell you the story. And I mean, as you know, and you are, I think, really onto something there, because it, like, no one ever fabricates a happy childhood in these books.
Right. That's not exciting.
Yeah, no one's ever no one ever comes from a terrible childhood, but then in their memoir, it's like it was sunshine and daisies. It's never that, because that doesn't sell. Nobody's going to be interested in that. And and I think in the case of James Fry, I mean, I think it's generally accepted. I can't say definitively this is true, but I think the general sort of belief there is that he tried to write it as a novel. And they were like, this is not going to sell as a novel. But, if this was like a memoir, it's a lot more compelling. And so suddenly it's a memoir. And I think that, I think that becomes a selling tool for a lot of people, especially if they want to be able to, because that instantly, if you inject that element into a book, it instantly makes it far more fascinating. I mean, if Go Ask Alice had come out and it had just said a novel, if it had just said, Go Ask Alice, a piece of fiction, it might have found an audience, but it would not have had this sort of intangible but clearly very effective aura of mystique around it. And calling something a memoir, and it is also worth noting, as you know, you may have noticed, I have a propensity to over-answer questions. So, but I will just say that one other thing that happened, and this was, I think, largely tied to Frank McCourt's book, Angela's Ashes, starting in the late 90s, memoir as distinct from autobiography. Memoir, and I think this happened, this is not just in the States. I believe this certainly also happened in Europe, where memoir became a gigantic growth segment of the publishing industry. Memoir started to become, because autobiography sort of sounds like homework and it sort of sounds dull and it just sounds like it's a lot of facts. Memoir is like a story and it's sort of pulpy and frothy. And also, memoir is it's somebody's own personal subjective recollections, which means that it's going to read a lot more like fiction. It's going to read a lot more like a novel. And that started this kind of golden age of people publishing memoirs, even people that, that otherwise might not be in and of themselves compelling. But
Right.
if they have this one thing that happened to them, or this one sort of horrible person in their life that they can then write a memoir about, that became a way to get traction as, especially a starting as a first time author. And so, yeah, you were definitely onto something. It actually ballooned after James Fry. I mean, it was even more prevalent after that.
The thing that really disturbs me, though, is that even now, these books are marketed as being real. And the copy of Jay's journal, for example, that I picked up from Amazon, it's freshly printed. It's got that lovely new book smell. There is no indication anywhere in here that this is fiction or that this is heavily fictionalized. And I wonder about the implications of that.
I mean, I think, it's, as you said, it is really astonishing. And one of the things when I first went into this project, I assumed, I think like a lot of people do, that when a book says fiction or nonfiction or autobiography or whatever, that somebody somewhere has signed off on that. In other words, that somebody has vetted it, that there are strict definitions, even if not legal definitions, that there are industry definitions for what is a memoir, what's nonfiction. And what I discovered is that's not really true. Those are just marketing handles and they don't have any real legal weight or fixed meaning to them. And so that is why, I mean, you'll see, I have a copy of Go Ask Alice somewhere. I own more copies of that book than any one person ever needs to own. But I've got a copy from, I think, 1986 that is this, and this is one single copy of the book where the same copy of the book is labeled fiction and autobiography and a real diary.
Yeah.
And you sort of like, well, what is even happening here? And then, as you noted, a lot of them now are just what I call agnostic. They have no designation whatsoever. And you're just sort of left to guess at whether they're true stories or not, although it doesn't help that they say a real diary on the front, and Jay's journal is positioned as a real diary. And so I think the upshot of that is, I mean, there's such a thing. I mean, as a card-carrying member of Gen X, it's like there is this middle ground between skepticism and cynicism. Skepticism is healthy. Cynicism, can be a little bit damaging. There's a middle ground, but I think if you are, for a book especially that is read now almost exclusively by teens and preteens, by young people, and if one of the very first books that they love, because young people especially Go Ask Alice, that book still sells and it still finds a new audience every year. And if you love this book and then you realize later, I mean, I saw somebody write an article about Go Ask Alice and it said, the book that defined my childhood turned out to be a lie. And there's something to be said for, not necessarily believing everything you're told, but there's also something to be said for, being able to trust something. And things like this make it hard to do that. And, and also the idea that, it does, I think as we've seen, especially over the last decade or so, when you really, when the underpinnings of what is true and what is false, and when the idea of just doubling down on something, and insisting that it's true, even as the evidence mounts that it's not, that starts to pay some really horrible dividends, down the line. And it really is quite, it really has quite an outsized impact, I think, on a society. I mean, I don't mean to make too much of it, but yeah, you're definitely correct about that. And it is still, I mean, even now, like almost a decade after I started this project, things like that still astonish me. The fact that you can go pick up two different copies of Jay's journal or of Go Ask Alice, and they're identified as being two entirely different things. I mean, it really is kind of mind-boggling.
It really is. Yeah.
It is. I think of, you talked a bit about YA lit, and it was sort of growing during the 70s and 80s. So looking at something like Judy Blume, she was another author, her approach in speaking to children was much more like empathetic and coming at it from their point of view, but she wasn't pretending necessarily to be one of them. The takeaway when I read her books as a teenage or adolescent girl versus when I read Go Ask Alice. Go Ask Alice was much more like a cautionary tale, almost like, some, not fairy tales, but those types of cautionary tales that you hear, like, don't slam the door because this little girl slammed the door and then the horseshoe fell and like hit her on the head and she died, like, so don't slam the door. It's that kind of thing. And so it feels much more like it's written by a fairly religious. I remember reading it at the time thinking, this sounds like a goody goody wrote it. Like, I don't know if it's because she was like from a decade before me or if she was just really like sheltered or something, but she doesn't talk the way I do. She doesn't use profanity. She doesn't talk about boys in the same way. It's all this kind of stuff. There's kids, I feel like they instinctively can tell if you're with them or kind of judging them. And that's why I'm so surprised that Go Ask Alice was so effective. But it really did seem to resonate with a lot of people, like you said, and helped people. But it does have a huge impact either way.
It does. And one of the reasons, I've thought about this a lot, how Go Ask Alice continues. Even now, 53 years after it came out, it continues to sell. As I said, a 50th anniversary edition just came out a couple of years ago from Simon and Schuster. It is still, and as you know,
Right,
it's on Amazon, and it's still, people are still reviewing it, and still, every now and again I've gotten much better about this, but I used to just check the reviews of Go Ask Alice on Amazon just to see the most recent ones, just to see like what is the consensus. And I guess I should no longer be surprised when people sort of embrace it wholehearted as being real, but they still do, and it is still sort of surprising. I think one of the benefits that Go Ask Alice has, and this is a thing I've thought a lot about, is that especially from our vantage point now, the language, the lingo, the vernacular, all that is so dated that it almost now can't become dated. In other words, like something from the early 2000s seems really dated because it's close enough that we can contrast it with what it was really like.
Yeah.
I was certainly not alive in 1971, and I would imagine most, like probably all of the new readers of Go Ask Alice have no idea what people actually talked like in the 70s. And so it might have actually rung more false for people in the 80s and 90s than now, because
I think so.
There are so few, if you were a teenager, if you were 16 years old in 2000, let's say, so you're born in 1984, so you're 16 years old in 2000, and you were keeping a journal or a diary, there's a fairly good chance that you were actually keeping it online. You were keeping a blog, or you were on LiveJournal.
LiveJournal.
Exactly.
MySpace.
If I wanted to go back and write a book that was, I want to try to channel the way that teenagers spoke in 2000, there are a lot of extant examples of that. I could go on and find a lot of those journals that are still archived and sort of, use that voice. There, with every year before that, as you go back, the number of existing examples of teenage diaries is just, is probably, drops to almost nothing by the time you get to the early 70s. So you can present Go Ask Alice as like, this is how kids talked. And there's really not a lot of readily available evidence to disprove that. So
Yeah.
it probably it'll continue to be sort of timeless, I think, as things go forward, because, there's really not a lot to compare it to that is, in that genre.
Yeah, I have this quote that I came across, and I have to share it because it feels so on point of what we're talking about. It was by Mark Oppenheimer in the New York Times in an article that I have in our show notes. He says, "I do not think children should read about heroin addiction, but if they must, it is a moral concern that the book be well written. A good war movie makes you despise war. A terrible one makes you grin, but a mediocre one might send you to the recruiting office." And yeah.
It is worth noting at this point that, so Beatrice Sparks got, to the end of her life, she got a lot of correspondence, a lot of letters from readers, and, a lot of them, by if that's an indication, those letters are an indication. I mean, a lot of them were from, 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds, people who were barely into their teenage years. And I have talked to more than one person and read many letters, written to her from young readers or people who were adults who had read those books when they were younger. And this is a thing you see a lot online of people saying, Go Ask Alice actually sort of made me really curious about drugs. Or I mean, I have talked to more than one person who actually said that Jay's journal, however sort of unbelievable parts it might have seemed, it actually got them sort of interested into the occult. That they sort of spent a long time kind of being fascinated by it because that was their introduction to this sort of bizarre, and obviously a lot of that dovetails with that era as well. I mean, I'm sure if you find any photo of me from my teenage years, there's a good chance that it's like, it's like a shirt that has like Ozzy Osbourne and Aleister Crowley like having a drink together or something. So,
sure.
But yeah, it definitely, it does have a sort of strange, dark allure, even now. And, that's again, one of those things where it's because it is labeled nonfiction, that goes through a different filter in your head sometimes. And the message and lesson you draw from something, I think, can be to some degree kind of heavily informed by how it is presented to you. And whether your brain is told to process it as real or not.
Someone says, "Go ask Alice Cooper."
I have tried for years to try to find a way to make that sort of pun, and I've never been able to do it.
That's great. So I will say this one last thing, just because it was one of my favorite parts of the book. The name of the book, Go Ask Alice, is of course a reference to the song White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. And you sort of mirror that in a lot of or I think in all of your chapter titles. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm reading it, and initially it kind of went past me, but then I saw a few and I was like, oh, that's a great song. And then I saw it again and I was like, oh my God. And I remember messaging Conrad and going, I think Rick is like a metalhead because he's like referencing like some deep cuts, like not just like it was pretty funny. So I would have like all sorts of songs like stuck in my head as I was, it does add a little fun, because like you said, it's a dark topic and we've been talking about it for about 90 minutes now, but there is some fun, not fun like we're making light of it, but interesting things that tie in. And I just love that as the tie, and I had to sort of give you props for that.
And I honestly don't remember how that started. It wasn't a conscious plan on my part, but at some point I just had started keeping this list of song titles. And as you noted, it's like, and I did, and so I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and it's, and I mean, my poor mother, especially at that point, she's just looking through, and it's like everything I listened to at that point seemingly had some dark secret message behind it. It's like, I would like listen to the band Wasp, and my mom.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I've heard that Wasp stands for We Are Satan's Prisoners.
We are sexually perverted. That's what Blackie Lawless says, right?
Exactly that. Or, Rush, isn't that ruled under Satan's hand?
Yeah.
And of course the Satanic Panic kind of dovetailed with the back and control movement and the PMRC and this idea of, these songs are leading your children to hell. And so much of that is kind of connected to this and the Jefferson Airplane thing. So they are almost all of them are song titles. I think the only one that is not is there's a chapter that is called Days Full of Night, which while not a song title is actually the way that Steven Tyler described like the depths of Aerosmith's drug addiction in the 1970s. He's like, man, it was just like days full of night. And I was like, I'm using that. And I wrote it down. The only title I was tried to use, but it pains me to this day that not really a metal band, but I really tried to use the title, the December song, Hazards of Love, which I tried to get that into the Alden and Teresa section somewhere, and it didn't really ever fit. So that's, maybe use that for something else.
You used Another Rainy Night Without You in that section, and that one really got me. I was just like kind of misty, like in that part, because I was, oh my God.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to say in the sort of opening, the sort of opening murder board segment of this, I saw the Operation Mindcrime cover go by, and I was like, hey, I recognize that. So
I did an episode on Operation Mindcrime years ago on the show, so that's why it's up there. But yeah, there were several Queensryches, if I am I correct. I
Yeah,
definitely remember that one though. But
and they did sort of seem to. I just real quickly. I know we have to.
yeah,
We're sort of wrapping this up, but they did really seem to. I mean, in a weird way, they did sort of. My brain was doing this subconscious filtering. They did seem to lend themselves to that because that one in
yeah,
particular, the Another Rainy Night Without You, is, you know, on the one hand, it's sort of interesting. It's like, oh, it's another song title, but on the other hand, it really is. You know, it's sort of this very sweet, sad, you know, kind of
yeah,
twist from
exactly.
that because it's a perfect, you know, it's a perfect sort of summary of that. So anyway, I appreciate that. That means a lot. I didn't know if anybody would notice those things, but
Yeah, if you get the references and you know the songs, it adds like another layer to the story you're telling, which is not just about Beatrice and it's not just about the families or the books. Or it's all sorts of things woven together, and it's just an extra layer, which I really appreciated. So, I know Conrad, you have this queued up in the backstage, but this book, Unmask Alice. I mean, this is not us just trying to promote it, but I do want to give props to Rick because this book was just so well written and so interesting that, you know, if you're interested at all in this topic, I think, you know, get the audiobook, get the real, like the hardcover book like I do, and give it a read because you won't be disappointed. It's really, really good.
thank you. I appreciate that. My publisher would also want me to say that the paperback is coming out at the end of July.
Oh,
So
okay,
if
great.
you know
The
somebody who,
link's in the comments or in the description of this video. So the link to the book is there, so you can find it on Amazon or
much
anywhere
obliged.
books are sold. Yeah,
And the audiobook is fantastic. So if
it
you're an
is.
audiobook fan, it's really quite good.
Loved it. I listened to it. It was great.
All right, thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
I couldn't stop it. In fact, I was getting notifications from Audible saying, you have listened to this more than anything else this month. But it really,
Yeah.
it is. I mean, whenever we do one of these episodes, we're always looking for really, really good sources. And we thought that we were going to be pulling from various different articles and so on. And then we happened upon your book and just thought, oh,
He's
the,
already done
the
all the research.
he's done it. Let's just get the guy to come and talk to us about it because it's great.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. That means a lot. And for what it's worth, that was really, you know, however, this always sounds a little glib, but I mean, that was really the reason I wrote the book is because it was, I knew, I mean, I was so fascinated by the story and I thought this book doesn't exist. If I want to read it, I guess I have to sort of research it and write it because it doesn't exist yet. And I sort of also knew I was like, I cannot be the only one who is fascinated by this story. So it means a lot that, you know, that it resonated with you. That really means more than I can possibly say. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Any
thank you for
last thoughts,
joining us.
Cameron? Yeah.
No, just to say thanks to Rick for joining
Yes.
us and for being so generous with your time. It's been
Absolutely.
great.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this does wrap up our episode of Dreamland. You can find our show notes with all of the links to all of our sources at retroblasting.com/dreamland. We'll be back in May, at the end of May, with our next show. And until then, you can follow me and Conrad on Retroblasting and Movie Oubliette, respectively, on all social media outlets. And you can email us at the Dreamland Podcast at gmail.com. You can find Rick's book linked in the description, like I said. And thanks everyone for listening. Goodbye.